All right. Hello. Welcome to the monthly short story discussion of A Sword and Sorcery, contemporary tale, hosted on the New Edge Sword and Sorcery Discord by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury, who, among other things, is the editor and publisher of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine. I am joined by our incredibly handsome and internationally recognized panel members, Jay Wolf and Matt Holder. Jay, starting with you, could you two please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Jay Wolf. I am editor and bon vivant of various publications and projects. I think that's about it, really, for the moment. That's all I got in there.
Fair. Matt?
I am Matt Holder. I write reviews for Strange Horizons, which may or may not be where you could encounter some of the stuff I've written, but I'm mostly a teacher.
Fair enough. All right. So, yeah, as I say, we're here to discuss a contemporary sword and sorcery short story. This will probably be in the title for the YouTube video, but why not? The story will be The Dog in the Corner by Stephen Graham Jones, a renowned horror author who is increasingly making his presence felt in the world of sword and sorcery, most recently, actually, with a Conan tale, part of a slew that are being published recently, which is pretty cool. But yeah, the story we're discussing today, The Dog in the Corner, was published not too long ago this year in Cullen Bunn's anthology Swords in the Shadows, which is billed as a swords and sorcery horror anthology featuring a murderer's row of very talented authors such as Stephen Graham Jones or Weird Tales editor Jonathan Maberry, Haley Piper, Joe R. Lansdale, and many other great folks. Sorry, I didn't list all your names. You can see that in the TOC, of course. Yeah, I chose The Dog in the Corner because, well, frankly, I'm among the many people intrigued by Stephen Graham Jones' increasing moves into the SNS realm, and the idea of a horror-specific SNS tale written by a horror author of his caliber really interested me. So I thought, hey, why not give that a whirl? Jay, do you mind sharing with us your first reactions to The Dog in the Corner?
Oh gosh. All right. So
Or I
as
can
far
bug Matt
as
first.
oh no, it's fine. I did that thing where I immediately I had just swigged a tiny amount of water. Um, so as far as first impressions go, so Oliver, one of the things that I remember that you talk about a lot is the the bodily as a part of sword and sorcery.
Mhm.
And this story is basically all bodily in a very visceral way. And it was it I'm trying to think of a way to even express the initial reaction I had because it's a story that really makes the reader complicit in what has happened to the main character, this fellow named Lorne.
Mhm.
And you are you are implicated in it simply by reading it. But at the same time, it makes you immediately sympathetic with him in a way that I thought was just fascinating.
I agree. Back to the bodily thing, it's kind of funny. In recent years, I've been trying more and more in my own writing to be more cognizant that there are senses other than sight and sound. you know,
Yeah.
and so it was very funny to pick this up and be like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, no, I mean Stephen Graham Jones is on it with this one for obvious reasons, given that we're dealing with a character whose eyes have been scooped out, and they've been raised as kind of a bloodhound, a human bloodhound." Yeah, Matt, how about you? What was your sort of general reactions to this thing?
I also sort of keyed into the how bodily it was, or sort of like sensual it was, and how material it was. I also was struck, I guess, by Stephen Graham Jones just sort of really going for it, and I was struck by how sort of like the sorcerer, I mean, we assume he's a sorcerer or whatever, actually felt like transgressive and evil in a, or he felt evil in a sort of really fundamental way, in a that I don't,
Oh, yeah,
it,
it's really profound, like
it did, yeah, it
how
didn't feel
nasty.
like sort of, genre He-Man Saturday morning cartoon Skeletor, whatever. Like this guy, is he's sort of trying to fundamentally reshape the universe, and I think in a bad way. And I think there's a lot of stuff in here about boundaries and like maintaining boundaries, but also like pushing against the boundaries and sort of transgressing the boundaries, and how do you define what makes a person and what makes a human. All these questions that Jones has dealt with in other of his work, like I don't know if his book
Yeah.
Mongrels is about like werewolves and stuff, and The Only Good Indians is about this elk-head woman, and he's very fascinated with like animal and like animus as a theme, and so I sort of those are some of the things I noticed, and there were moments where I was like where he puts his hand in the paw print or the hand print and it matches his own or whatever, like moments that really stuck with me as very kind of shocking in a way.
Oh, there's some really good like chilling little details scattered throughout.
Yeah, I felt this was a really tight story, I felt like it had exactly as many characters as it needed, and no more. I felt like it had enough suggestions of a bigger world. Like there was a line later in the story where it just mentions when describing this sort of sorceress Dr. Moreau we've got here, stepping on an eyeball. And it
Yeah.
takes a moment to be like his heels were very
Oh.
calloused. Callous as being a sign of prestige or progress in his order. And that's it. We never hear any more about the Sorcerer's Order. We don't know if they're nearby or far away or how the hell any of that works. It doesn't matter because it's just like we're getting this little extra detail in with the grossness of him treading on an eyeball. That just hints. It's just enough to hint at a bigger world. I don't know. For me, that hit the bullseye of just enough for this little short story in terms of that kind of inference of a bigger place. While really, we only get to meet the people who are directly involved with what's going on and don't hear any real names of anybody else. Did you guys appreciate that, or do you feel like would have liked more world building?
Oh,
No, I do not.
Yeah,
No.
I don't think you could. Oh, sorry, Matt.
No, I think the little bit of world building we get, which is very minimal. I mean, we learn about this weird village. I mean, the world is closed off because it's closed off to Lorne as a character, and I feel like the more that we would have known, it would have kind of broken the sort of immersion he was going for.
Yeah, one of the things that I found was really interesting is that he's aware that he's supposed to have eyes, which to me, I thought that was kind of strange, actually, if only because of when this injury would have happened to him. And so that was something that I thought that was a unique character detail, not because I thought it was wrong, but just because it implies things that that are not on page, that the reader has to figure out what that means for themselves. Like what kind of trauma does that have with it? And I mean, this story is a story that has a lot of obviously, like, there's a lot of on-page trauma and off-page trauma, and it's not shy about it, which makes it again that sort of like engagement of complicity thing, where you have to sort of confront what has been done to this person and what that means going forward for that person.
And what's been done to who knows how many others, right? Like, I mean, part of him breaking free from his master is realizing / kind of being reminded, I got the impression, that, oh, I'm just the latest in the series and there's going to be more after me. Like, I'm just Abel and Hound. I'm not Master's precious.
Just like untold generations of trauma.
Yeah, because in the one throwaway line, we do catch that the sorcerer has been doing this to children taken from the village and earlier, I suppose, animals in the woods for quote unquote generations. So who knows how many hundreds of years. How do you feel it makes the reader complicit in what's going on?
Well, because you honestly have to imagine doing that to someone. Just a little bit. It's not necessarily like, again, like this is not a flaw in the story. I think this is by design. It makes you think about what it would take to make you a person who thinks, well, the easiest way to get the eyeball out would be to, use a hot spoon so that it cauterizes the wound. That amount of information tells you that someone has done that before, and they know that they need to cauterize that wound because otherwise other things are going to happen there. Like that, it's all very subtle, and this is just part of Stephen Graham Jones's mastery in general, but there's so many little things like that make you just like the things that you have to imagine have happened in order for that information to exist for that character is just really stunning.
Yeah, and it does really help, put you into Lauren's head and to get you to a place where you think about some of the stimuli in the story in ways that you might not otherwise. Like early on, when Lauren finds the guy who's been gutted by the bear, and
Yep.
he can smell infection in the guy's gut and describes it as being kind of tangy. Like I went straight from a vague sense of this guy's been disemboweled to tangy, and I just started thinking about foods I've had. And I mean, that's silly to say out loud, but it did. There I am thinking, okay, well, what would it really be like to be Lauren Tangy? Okay, how do I process that? As opposed to if it just been thrown off, oh, this guy's been gutted, and I'd be like, well, I don't know anything about that from my life, blessedly, so whatever. It brings you in that little bit more, and I guess it lends itself to that complicity that you describe, and in turn makes it more horrifying later when the
Yes.
new kid is going to be prepared by having all of its senses removed. And I felt very much with Lorne in that moment of, oh God,
Mhm.
wait, he's going to do this and this, and like walks you through it. That sort of authority lens that gets lent to the voice of writing. I feel when you have things explained, you do this and this and that, even when it's something fantastic or strange or terrible or all those things wrapped up in a big ball like we have here. I really felt like with Lorne by that point. So I suppose it does what you want good writing to do, right? It immerses you in the
Yes.
character. Um, yeah.
Jones, and I
Uh,
think so. Jones is like he is a literary writer, and I mean that both in like the genre sense, but also in the sense of how he approaches. Like he is a language first writer,
Mhm.
and he comes out of like the literary. His first novels, they're all like literary books, very experimental, formal, weird stuff that no one read. And he writes genre stuff now because he likes it, but also people actually read what he writes and stuff. But that level of like super close, granular obsession with minute details, like that's very much a kind of trope that comes out of his literary sort of aspirations, which I think is a good thing to glom onto in terms of your own writing and storytelling or whatever. Like there's so much value outside, he does. Somehow I doubt he spent much time thinking about whatever world this exists in. What I do think he spent a lot of time thinking about were the smells and what it feels like to put your hand on the ground and what it feels like to lick something like metal. Like that's what he's sort of that's his preoccupation as a writer. Is sort of characterizing things through these very well observed details, which is
Yes.
one of the reasons I like him.
Oh
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think that was definitely something that I noticed throughout. And in terms of like, there were a couple of times where I noticed that there were sensory details that I felt like the character should not necessarily have. Just because, like, there were some things where it's just like, well, that's an interesting observation if you don't have eyes. But it wasn't. It never did those things last long enough for me to be like, oh, right. Like, there was no it wasn't strong enough to be like a refrigerator moment. It was like, oh, well, maybe he's internalized what this word means to execute, or you know what I mean? Just to sort of like to exposit. There we go.
Yeah.
Certain little specific things. But it was just God, it was just so bodily. The whole thing is really, like, wonderfully, deliciously gross in that sense, and, I thought it was just everything about it really, like, clicked together for me on the whole, that anything that I noticed that wasn't really, like, a singular. I'm trying to think of a way to put it, like, there again, I can't even summon an exact example of the type of thing I'm talking about, that's how minor it is. So,
Fair. I
um
mean, there was a sort of cheat page on, in the hard copy, at least page 243, where, the new baby is being pulled out of the sack. The thing's about to start happening here. And then it reads, was it here? Sorry, I have it right in front of me, but I lost my space on the page. Yeah, right. Lorne turned his face to the heat. He could feel it warming in the back of the caverns that should hold his eyes. And for the first time, maybe because of the magic from the core of the sword, he sort of saw something. And then we get, himself as an infant, the
Right.
struggling pup, and you get this kind of like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it fills in the details there. And again, like I said, it was never something that broke my immersion. It was always just sort of like, huh, that's an interesting observation for this character to make.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and as far as the quote unquote cheat page, I mean, I say that with love because honestly, like, I did feel it added to the story. I wasn't sitting there being like, "Hey," like some sort of cinema sins, nonsense. Ding, Steve Graham Jones. Anyway,
I was just gonna say, like, oh, really?
yeah, sorry, that put a bad taste in my mouth as I said
Bringing
it.
it down in here.
But yeah, and also actually, to Matt, what you were saying about the literary voice, how did you feel about Stephen Graham Jones's use of language maybe being perhaps more literary? Because I wonder, I haven't seen really, I would say much of it thus far. I'm at Stephen Graham Jones' story now, so I've got about a third of the anthology left to read. But in what I've read so far, I haven't seen a lot of people clamoring to do like their best Robert E. Howard impression. You know what I mean? To try and capture capture that kind of language, the kind of quote unquote um, stereotypical sword and sorcery language.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. To me, like talking about his style or his form, which I'm assuming is what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Stephen Graham Jones writes in a way that to me feels like almost breathless or almost reckless. So like he feels like someone when he writes that I don't know how much revision he does. He could be someone who revises a lot and that's how he creates this effect. But on the page, it almost feels like he's writing so fast and so quickly that it creates this kind of propulsion and momentum. His sentences are often quite long,
Mm.
longer than they might be otherwise, um, compared to, I don't know, others. Uh, but his dialogue is often short, like it feels very natural. He doesn't have people say too much, or if they do talk, they feel very conversational and like regular humans or whatever. But to me, that's what I know. I also, I mean, just looking on that page, you were just at 243, right in the middle of that page. Smell can give you location, it can give you history, it can divulge intentions, but it can't map planes, it can't draw lines, it can't inhale the shape of a thing, of a face, a person, a master. That's very much written by someone who, like, to me, understands that writing has rhythm and it also can rhyme with itself and it has all
Mhm.
this parallel structure. Again, to me, those are the things that I sort of notice and pick up on when I read him. It's just he very much, again, I think he considers the language before he considers almost anything else on the page.
Yeah, that was another thing that I noticed. I'm a big fan of repetition and patterns, like the one that you just called out there. Um, and that actually kind of brings me to mind of Michael Moorcock, who does a lot of the same thing. And that's about
Mm.
as sword and sorcery as it gets.
Good
That
point.
habit of like a staccato of images that all stitch together very seamlessly at the end. That literary technique is very much in the flavor of sword and sorcery. And that was definitely one of the things that just as I was going through the story, like I felt it and absorbed it, but I didn't necessarily take a lot of notes on it. Just because it was present, it was there, and it did not, again, didn't break my immersion. It was part of the desired effect.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And good point about Moorcock, which I feel a fool for not having thought of myself. If only because I am having the good fortune to publish a story by him and did some editing work on it. Oh well, here we are. Yeah, and I gotta say, I really appreciated even the ending. Given that this was again, I've got a third of the book left to read. We'll see what I pick up in that. But on what I've read in the first two thirds, which I've certainly enjoyed other stories in it, but his was by far the most visceral. I think it was fair to say. You guys will probably agree with me once you get a
This
chance
is like
to
one of
read.
the top 5 most visceral stories I feel like I've read in a long time.
Yeah. And very much in that character's perspective and all that stuff. But and yet, as visceral and as truly evil as what is being attempted in this to turn, the babe into a kind of um sixth sense sensory post.
Right.
A person with no senses except what inner eye it hopefully will have. Is the other thing. I love that it's just like this is an experiment. Let's see what happens if you remove all the senses. Yeah. Even with all that kind of stuff and things, really just sorry. I mean, I'm just kind of gushing a little bit, but whatever. I think of
Well,
one detail in particular that really stuck out to me about, again, coming back to the guy with his guts torn out early on, and how when the guy eventually dies and Lauren gets to like stick his snout in and eat whatever he feels like eating out of the guy, and he goes straight to the guy's stomach to taste the meal because of how it might remind him of the nearby village that he knows he came from. And then he's like, "Oh, this is a meal I don't recognize. It's from even further afield. I can't imagine what that is." And then just moves on. Like, yeah, yeah. Even with all these kinds of like morbid and lonely and horrifying details in it, it does end on a kind of hopeful note that doesn't feel saccharine either. Like, how did you? Starting with you, Matt. How did you guys feel about the ending?
I like the ending. I think you're right. It doesn't feel saccharine simply because, like, I mean, this guy's world is real bad.
yeah.
I mean, he's not he's not okay. I mean, he got away and he's with these bear people or whatever. I still don't quite know exactly what they are. Bear without fur. But
Yeah, I was like, is he got human skin? But yeah, that's okay.
I
It's
don't
fun to
know.
imagine.
But and he's got the kid, so setting up, I don't know, Jungle Book type story, I suppose. Um, but yeah, to me, it felt, the story was about these breaking of cycles, or about trying to break this cycle. And again, he broke the cycle, but there still feels like residual harm, not only to his own person, but again, to almost like the world itself is not quite right. After everything that this sorcerer has done, or the master.
Yeah, and exactly, it ends on just the whole idea of like, well, he has no sense of what tomorrow might hold, but things feel better because it wouldn't be the same as yesterday. So as you say, breaking cycles, right? And I really appreciated that it doesn't, I sort of imagined he was going to bring the kid down to the village and be like, here, try and bring it back to his mom. But like, that's not going to go super well, is it? So
No, I mean that kid's life is probably also not going to be the best. Who knows?
well, am I misremembering? Sorry, I just reread it, but like, didn't he get in there before the kid's senses got sealed and stolen and stabbed out?
He did.
I
Yeah,
think he
you're
did.
right. Now he'll just be raised by weird animal people, I guess.
Potentially. How about you,
Might
Jay?
be,
How did you
but
feel
yeah,
about it?
that does make sense though, that he would actually take it back to the mom. That seems to be the most logical thing. But see, that would have been like a saccharine ending.
Oh,
And
I
I
would have been
don't.
so I would have been so upset if that was the ending.
Yeah,
Well, to me, it's fun to imagine him doing it afterward and then being like, well, okay, they'll be happy they got the baby back, but they're not going to accept him as a citizen of the village or
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
it doesn't actually like that's one of those things where like that's an ending that sounds like the right ending, but it's not the right ending.
Mhm.
I wanted to kind of like piggyback on one of the things that Matt pointed out, which was the idea that like this the one evil has been defeated in this thing, but the greater scope and scale of what this sorcerer has done is unfixable. That this
Yep.
world is very much going to be the product of this sorcerer for an untold period of time to come. Long after Lorne is out of the picture, that picture is still going to be pretty horrific. And that was one of the things that really grabbed me. Just, and I mean, I think that that's thematically resonant in general with a lot of his work. But
Mhm.
it was just like, that was, I think, like kind of my lasting takeaway was like, this world has been destroyed by the wanton needs of this very delusional sorcerer. And so everyone within range of him is someone who is at best going to have to like pick up the pieces and live with the damage.
Yeah. I also wonder about how much the villagers might remember, right? Like, does killing this guy undo some of the magic he's inflicted on them in the past?
Yeah, well, and that's one of the kind of joys of how tight this world building is
Mhm.
that that is almost entirely out of the scope and parameter of the story so far that you just sort of like, well, I hope somebody cares.
Yeah, and it's
It'd be
interesting to
nice if
think
somebody
about or
cared.
even discuss on a panel, right? As opposed to having it all spelled out for us, which I suppose comes back to one of those things that's not exclusive to sword and sorcery, but I do feel is if found to be found in the best of it is this tighter focus and only telling you what you really need and letting inferences and wonderings fill in the gaps for you.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I would be really troubled if there was, like, something didactic about the way this ended.
yeah, and that's why you be good to kids and animals. Like, all right, yeah. um, Yeah. So okay. So I feel like we've discussed the story itself pretty thoroughly. Unless there's anything else either of you want to add, in which case, by all means, please leave in. But we were
One
discussing before we hit record. Pardon me, Matt.
one last thing I wanted to
Sure.
mention that I do like about the story, and I sort of mentioned it at the beginning, but like the story is dealing with almost like taboo subjects in a way. Like you are not supposed to like hurt kids. Like that's in most cultures that's pretty bad. And you're also not
Mhm.
supposed to eat people. That's also pretty bad. Like that's a kind of taboo. And one of the
Mhm.
reasons I like the story is just, and this is in a lot of Jones' work, but he is just not interested in being safe and playing it safe. And I'm so tired of reading stuff that feels safe, and I just like that this really like went somewhere that is pretty bad. And in that way, it didn't feel safe. Like he's dealing with these taboo subjects, and he's like indulging them. He's like sort of putting them on display, which is again, it's just something that makes the story not feel safe, and that's something that I like in sort of what I read. Uh, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially given that we're seeing things through Lauren's eyes, ahem, and that normalizes so much of the awfulness until some of it is rejected by Lauren in the back end. So yeah, yeah. Um, Okay, so I'm kind of curious. How do you both feel like, as we talked about a little bit before we hit record, and I'm curious to discuss on mic here. This Swords in the Shadows anthology was billed as a swords and sorcery horror anthology. And the reaction I saw among some to that when this first was being kickstarted was, well, what are you talking about? Horror is an intrinsic part of sword and sorcery. It was there at its roots back in the weird fiction days, back in the pulps in the 30s. The genre lines were less well defined, and sword and sorcery was, yeah, fantasy, but also historical adventure, but also some elements of science fiction would creep in, and absolutely horror. Not just the more obvious, things like Lovecraftian elements that snuck into Howard stories. So, did you feel this story like? Would you just call it sword and sorcery, or would you feel it requires the delineation that, like, yes, well, it's sword and sorcery, but like it's leaning heavy on the horror, or it's a sword and sorcery horror tale? Starting with you, Jay, how do you guys feel about that?
Oh, well, so one of the things that I've had to spend a lot of time thinking about recently is categorization for the purposes of getting people to look at things.
Mhm.
And so, in that regard, I actually think tagging it horror is really smart because it does I mean, first of all, because it does lean really hard on the horror, in my opinion. I did not read a lot of the other stories. I skimmed a couple of them just sort of because, like, oh, I recognize that name. I would like to see what this is about.
Mhm.
But I haven't actually had a lot of time to dedicate to it, so it's sort of on the back burner for the moment. But I did want to say, like, yeah, there is actually like I think there's an argument, and honestly, I think there's an argument for putting the specific tag of horror on a lot of sword and sorcery items. Um,
Mm.
Simply because it's a it's a market and it is kind of a separate market from the fantasy market. And so drawing eyes across that bridge, across that barrier that sort of exists but doesn't exist in terms of marketing, I think is really smart. Um, just in terms of trying to grab crossover eyes. Um, I don't think it's an inaccurate description for this specific anthology either, but it just is a general thought. I think more people in that basket should think about marking sword and sorcery, at least as a subcategory with horror.
All right. How do you feel about it, Matt?
I also, I mean, thinking of this story in particular, I do think it's more of a horror story. This whole anthology is mostly horror writers who I imagine were asked to give me a sword and sorcery story with horror.
Mhm.
And I think part of that is probably a response to like the kind of general perception of what sword and sorcery is, which is sort of like muscly barbarians and stuff and silly nonsense. And sort of, so I think that is part of where this kind of package comes from. Yeah, I don't see any problem with like labeling it horror as well, just because I mean, some of that old stuff is horror in some ways, but some of it is not, or like whatever's scary. So, like the tension between so much sword and sorcery and horror is that you can't have a hero necessarily who's just going to kill everything and walk away and be okay in a horror
Mm.
story necessarily, because the genres in some ways kind of ask you to do separate things. And so
Mhm.
you have to, it becomes a matter of where you place emphasis. And to me, this is just, we're going to place more emphasis on, you know, the horror side. We're not going to have the big muscly barbarians come in and hack the thing with a sword, because that's no longer horror in my opinion. It may be weird and it may still exist in that genre, but the stakes are very different. I'm not worried about Conan going insane or succumbing to whatever the evil, like he's going to win. It's just going to happen, you know?
Even if victory for him is running away, right? I mean, something that's
Yeah.
always kind of amusing is when you read your first Conan story where you encounter something horrifying and you're like, okay, he's going to stab it. Oh, no, he is also horrified and is trying to get out of there. But ultimately, he lives, as you say, and is not, a Lovecraft protagonist who's insane at the end. So yeah,
Kevin's point in the chat, I think, is really good. In horror, there are no victors, only survivors.
Yeah, good point, Kevin. Good point. And I mean, it's kind of interesting with the Stephen Graham Jones story that we've just read because arguably Lorne is a victor in the sense that he achieves his goal. He does something that is actually quite heroic. He saves a baby, from an evil sorcerer. Classic sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy, even really getting into heroics there. But you know,
Yeah, no, he's a
I would,
survivor. He's a survivor.
he's a survivor. Yeah,
He's a
exactly. I
victor.
don't.
He's a victor in the way that the final girl is a victor, right? Like he's a
Right.
victor in the way that the last girl at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is laughing and screaming, covered in blood, driving away from the Chainsaw Man. Like it's that kind of victor where it's like, okay, you're not dead, but you're also not okay.
You're not ever going to be the same.
No.
You are
Yeah,
permanently
yeah.
marked and changed by your experience.
Yes, and boy, if that isn't, a side of most horror stories where, anybody actually lives. Yeah. I must confess, when I very first heard of the anthology, I felt a mix of feelings. I was super intrigued because I was, excited to see sort of a known quantity. Cullen Bunn's not coming out of nowhere here. He's a very well respected author,
Mhm.
comic sphere and elsewhere, doing an anthology of sword and sorcery. So someone outside of what I kind of think of as kind of the choir, the usual characters. So that was neat because I was like, oh, good, it's expanding. Great. I want to see that. And the theme, I admit, for a half second, I did have kind of a knee jerk, like, oh, well, isn't horror an intrinsic part of it, But two things really change my mind on that. One of them is actually reading it, of course. Going through and going, yeah, okay, like stories such as the one we've discussed tonight, absolutely, like are more akin to that phrase I like to abuse, about Robert E. Howard draping other genres over sword and sorcery, draping sword and sorcery over other genres like a cloak. For a lot of these, it does feel kind of like doing that, right? It's sword and sorcery being draped over horror. At its core, a lot of these stories are very more horror than anything. So it's a worthy delineation. The other thing that really changed my mind was, forgive the self plug, but editing the new issues of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, issues 1 and 2, because I did look back at our issue 0 and feel like, well, there wasn't really a lot of horror, as much horror as I wanted or felt I wanted, or I don't know. And so trying to differentiate our issues that are going to be out soonish. I specifically was like, yeah, let's get some horror in here. And I even reached out to an author, an artist, Daniel Vega, who has a real knack for particularly I can't speak tonight, pardon me, horrific renderings, and paired him with a suitable story, Carnivora by Kurt Johnson. So if I'm doing that, then I mean, how can I have any issues? How can I be like, oh, well, horror is an unnecessary tag. Let me turn over and do that to my own stuff. So yeah, it was interesting, sort of feeling my relationship to this change, and ultimately, like, I'm really into it. I think there are some stories that don't feel enough like either genre to me. Funny enough, again, we could be a jerk and name names, but there was one or two stories that didn't really feel like an S&S to me, and also like didn't feel like horror in the sense of really grabbing me at a visceral level the way Stephen Graham Jones's story did, but instead just kind of had signifiers of horror. Do you know what I mean?
Oh
Just like,
yeah.
oh, like here's tentacles or whatever. I'm not referring to a specific story with that. Yeah, and just me being kind of like, okay, well, here's the surface elements, but if it's not really sword and sorcery, and it's just kind of like, yeah, anyway. But the point is not to crap on things. So yeah, so the genre distinction does feel worth it then. Okay, yeah, and then you make a good point to the business argument, Jay, which is of course something that influences creativity all the time.
Unfortunately.
Um, we
This, I
can
mean,
just
the anthology is like it does feel like something that came out outside of whatever we consider like the small niche like SNS community. Like again, these are all horror people.
Mhm.
I don't consider them like SNS authors or even fantasy authors. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, honestly, like Cullen Bunn is the biggest name attached to sword and sorcery in a long time. Like I mean, no shame to Sterling, but I don't know who that guy is. And the guy who wrote the latest Conan book, like, I'm sorry. And honestly, like, Stephen Graham Jones is also the highest profile name in the past, I don't know, 5, 10 years that's been attached to this genre. And so I think it's interesting. I mean, this is, frankly, this will bring more people into SNS than some of the stuff that gets done in the more kind of like niche indie spaces, which is all very good and helps to like evolve the genre in other ways. But as far as like trying to bring people in, I mean, Cullen Bunn is like a comic superstar. He's not a lightweight. Like he's huge. And the same with
Mhm.
Stephen Graham Jones. Like they're the ones that are going to get people to pick up and read this stuff.
Butts in seats, as they say.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
well,
they're
I was thinking
good.
maybe a
Like you
couple of
should,
other
that's who you
names like
should
Jonathan
get to
Mayberry,
write your stuff.
but
Sorry.
that's okay, Matt. Sorry, please repeat what you said.
I
Yeah, I
was
mean
gonna say
Jonathan Mayberry I think would be like
that's
closer to
true.
a sword and sorcery
He's
name, sure.
Yeah, he is big. But like these are the kinds of guys that you want, just people that you want to get to to do this stuff. Like as they're sort of slowly kind of relaunching, or not relaunching, but like Titan is doing whatever it's doing with the Conan properties. Like I
Mhm.
still sort of, some of it looks super exciting and super awesome, and then some of it I'm just like eye roll. Like why? How is this going to do anything? I don't understand what the goal is here.
It's the
But I
stuff that makes
also
you roll your
sort of,
eyes.
yeah, I also
Like
think
stuff.
that like the best way to, or the only way honestly to like move something or evolve it or change it or whatever is like you have to do like experimental things. You've got to give it to people that are going to be like, I don't care whatever happened 1,000 years ago, when like I like this is what I think it is, and I have a voice, and that's what's more important to me than anything is like, do you actually have something to say? And like let those
Mhm.
people tell those stories.
Widening the circle a little bit of like who
Yeah,
is telling these stories and how they're telling them. And unfortunately, I mean that does mean that sometimes the stories aren't told the way that like we specifically would want them told. But it
right.
also means that it changes it improves the possible shape of the genre
Yeah,
and what it can execute.
I completely agree. I always like to kind of like dig in and pick at it a little bit, I suppose, this sort of
Oh, sure.
threshold between like the fear of it not growing and it just being the same voices telling the same stories over and over again, photocopies of the canon or whatever, and it shrivels and goes away over time. Or, the circle expands so fast in such a manner that it diffuses somehow, And what is sword and sorcery gets, because I mean this is often discussed, right? In the choir is this sort of frustration at how the term sword and sorcery has become to more people than are into it, I think. Synonymous with just, I don't know, fantasy, right? And so when something like this comes out, there's that feeling of like, okay, well, it's good that it's growing, but is it really adding to what we consider actually sword and sorcery,
Yeah.
or is it just more mislabeling of epic fantasy or whatever the heck?
You are
Um,
always like, I think you're always going to piss people off, and you should. I mean, this is what happened when you had 50 sci-fi Asimov boring whatever robot stuff, and then you have people like Harlan Ellison and Michael Moorcock with their stuff. I mean, they pissed so many people off because everyone was like, "This isn't science fiction. What is this like psychoanalysis nonsense?" Right? You're
yeah,
always, like to me, you should make people mad, like to art good, in my opinion. But um that's gonna happen. So there are gonna be these tensions. People are gonna fall off, slide away, and be like, "This isn't my sword and sorcery, whatever." And it's like, fine, go read your sword and sorcery, whatever. Or read whatever you want to read.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah, no, absolutely.
mean,
I think what I find interesting with sword and sorcery is the fact that it is a subgenre, right? Like with sci-fi, broadly speaking, like absolutely people should be coming in and messing it up. Same with fantasy, broadly speaking. But when you have like this sort of niche, right? How much can you expand a niche before it becomes unrecognizable? So I'm not trying to be a concern troll here. I'm literally a guy trying to widen the circle with my own publications. So you know, but it is a tension that I suppose because of my publication that I am constantly thinking about. And I do feel that again, I've got a third left to go, pardon me, but based on the two-thirds I've read, I think this anthology is cool. I think it's worth reading. I think it's a good addition, to the contemporary sword and sorcery scene, and, certainly I love Stephen Graham Jones's story, and it absolutely ticks all the boxes for me as sword and sorcery, even though it doesn't feature a mighty Thú Clonan or whatever. To me, that's not sword and sorcery, that's something else, so to speak. It, not the epitome of sword and sorcery, I should clarify. But yeah, I think this is good, and also we need to remind ourselves sometimes. I think like anthologies are great, like laboratories, right?
Oh,
So
absolutely.
like, I'm going through this, and like I don't expect every story to blow me out of my chair in terms of quality or what I perceive as quality. I don't expect every story to meet my most exacting sword and sorcery criteria. Instead, I'm just gonna be like, "Okay, well, here are the ones that work for me, and here are the authors that intrigue me, and, like, I'll build from there." So, and certainly I feel enough stories in the two-thirds I've read so far, have hit, rung that bell, the bell of general, like, "Okay, this is neat, and this is adding something cool. Alright, I'm there, I'm here for it." Yeah.
and anthologies are great for like discovering authors. Like I don't know how many times I've read some story by some person in an anthology, and I go and find whatever whatever it is that they wrote. And I think with this, because it is coming more from the horror space, you're going to, if you're a fan of SNS, if you are a writer of SNS, go out and you like one of these stories, like go out and read these other authors' stuff. It's mostly horror stuff, but doing that is going to like just add more tools to your toolbox or whatever, as far as things that you can bring into, your own storytelling, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a
Mhm.
really good point. In terms of just like widening the scope of what we read in general, it's definitely, especially when you're really interested, when you have a really like tight special interest that's in a really really tight niche, spreading out and figuring out things that are outside of that niche that are still appealing to you. That's actually, yes, that's so smart. And finding artists, authors, excuse me, that do that for you by, like, looking at other stories that those authors have written is just spot on. I can say from my experience doing anthology work too that the juggling act that it takes to put together a compelling anthology and really have it all speak the same language while really representing the visions of so many different authors, like it takes a lot of work for that to really come together. And in that regard, I think Cullen Bunn has done a really fantastic job with the pieces that I have read so far from here. So,
Mhm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Plus, I mean, anthologies themselves are a big part of the sword and sorcery tradition, right?
yes, a
Definitely
long
second wave,
conversation.
going onward, yeah. Okay, well, unless there's anything either of y'all wanna add to the story or the anthology discussion, I think we're getting about time to wrap up. Matt, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I will say that this book has like a freaking awesome cover by Anne
Mm.
Marie Cochran is their name. And I mentioned that just because it's not, I don't know. I'll just say that it's a very cool cover, and I'll just not say anything else. If nothing else, you should pick it up for the cool cover, which gives you all the sort of barbarians and swords and tentacles that you can want. Uh, and also read other Stephen Graham Jones stuff. Like he's super good. He is one of my favorite writers. I think he's incredible. I think you can learn a lot from him as a crafts person, and I think you can also learn about how to like make your characters believable and compelling in a short amount of space. So
Absolutely.
read his
Do you have a
stuff.
preferred starting point with him?
So for me, like I sort of read him when he blew up really big, which was with The Only Good Indians, and so that is
Mhm.
what I recommend to people. That book sort of just blew me away, and I think it's incredible. He's got his trilogy now, like My Heart is a Chainsaw. If you're like a huge horror fan and you just love like horror film and cinema, then you should check out My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is kind of his love letter. It's like the first of this trilogy he's doing. He's got a bunch of novellas. Night of the Mannequins is super good about the movies. He's got a ton of Mongrels is about werewolves. He's got a book called Lead Feather, like if you're into historical fiction and stories about like indigenous peoples and colonization, imperialism, extraction, all that good stuff. Lead Feather is really good. That's when he was still doing more of his like literary experimental stuff. But yeah.
I'm just sitting here nodding along. I just want to throw out a quick shout out for his book Mapping the Interior, which just like blew my mind when I read it the first time.
I haven't read that one yet, but it's real short. I know I need to pick it up.
I'm gonna just go ahead and say like, yeah. I'll let you. I don't want. I'm terrible at telling people like why they should read things, but that one changed my craft for the better. So
Awesome. Okay. So do you have any other final thoughts, Jay, or are you good?
I mean, honestly, I just like at the end of the day, like my thought is like, God, I love Stephen Graham Jones.
Fair. I am slowly working through more and more of his bibliography. I'm really digging it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, as far as me, I think I kind of said my piece about the book and the story for now. So yeah, I'll just say to anyone listening, thank you for listening to this and joining us. I hope we'll continue this monthly short story contemporary sword and sorcery short story discussion thing. I'm going to tentatively throw out a book, a story, and a date, but date to be firmed up later. I'm going to say 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday 18th. So we'll throw that out there for a date and time. And then for the book, I would like to go to another sword and sorcery anthology because we've been embarrassed with riches this year. We've had quite a few come out. I would like to go over to A Book of Blades, Volume 2, the annual question mark. We've only had 2 so far. Anthology series put out by the Rogues in the House Sword and Sorcery podcast crew. And of the stories within it that I would like to have a look at, we've talked about a couple of dudes so far. We've had Howard Andrew Jones in the last one, Stephen in this one. Let's read something by a lady. Let's read The Wolves of Winter Road by T.A. Marketon, which I kind of got a kick out of reading the other night at someone's recommendation, and I would love to chat about it with other humans. Okay. All right. So, again, thank you very much, Matt, for joining us. And I don't know if you have anything you want to plug. I'll take that as a no. All right, Jay, do you have anything coming out you want to mention?
Oh gosh. So technically I do, but I can't tell you what it is.
Yes.
I do have a novel coming out this month. It'll be one of a number of novels coming out this month from the Inkfort Press Self-Publishing Derby, which is an anonymous publishing contest, ? That basically a bunch of us have taken a couple of months to do a nano-ish type mad dash to finish a book. And now it's about to be out. We're on the precipice.
Absolute madness. And so if you join us for the next panel, by that point, you'll be allowed to say which book was yours?
I will be 1 week out from being able to unmask.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll have a status check on exactly how nuts I feel.
Fair enough. And I, as ever, am the editor of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine. Pre-orders for issues 1 and 2 is available now. Go to newedgeswordandsorcery.com. Issue number 1 featuring a new Elric story by Michael Moorcock himself. But there are plenty of other not yet legendary authors whose fiction and nonfiction you can enjoy, along with a bevy of gorgeous art, including Daniel Vega's horrifying stuff that I mentioned earlier. All right. Thank you all for listening and for participating and doing that thing. We'll come back here in about a month. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.